Contact advisory. The maple leaned in over the fence, like a neighbor who never finished a story. Theo had strapped the little trail camera to its scabbed trunk in late autumn, half for the deer and half for the gentle routine of swapping cards and seeing the yard explained back to him in patient pictures. It was a thing to do after early mornings at the warehouse, a small, quiet hobby that didn't ask much beyond fresh batteries and a memory card slid home without grit. He liked the crispness of the night frames and the way fog lit up like milk under the infrared. He liked the plain record of his own life too, his boots on the porch, the wheelbarrow leaning where he'd left it, that place in the grass where the dog he used to have had worn a winding track that still showed up darker after rain. Sunday began with Frost filming the mower handle, his own breath a modest engine. He crossed the yard with his shoulders hunched and pulled the card from the slot. The camera ticked a little light and sighed back to sleep. Inside, the house held that thin chill that meant the furnace had run, but only just. It took a kettle and the oven cracking to lift the rooms to comfort. Theo set the card into the plastic viewer, thumbed through the buttons, watched the deer move like they were remembering how legs worked. The raccoon had that funny habit of rinsing air as if it had to clean nothingness before claiming it. A fox drifted through, with the close-coat look of something that had learned to be a rumor. The yard did what yards did. Then the hour turned later all at once. A little jump in the counter that meant the wind had bumped the motion sensor, or the camera had slept through a pause. At some hour, with a long breath in its name, the two men came through the gap where the fence boards never quite met. They were not his men. He didn't know the jackets or their dark shoes, didn't know the quick way they moved, with their shoulders tucked, and their heads close, as if they were keeping news underwater. Their faces were as crisp as any daylight shot. Jawline, an old thin scar pulling an ear down, a logo he could have Googled if he had needed to. But the hands were not hands. Blocks rode where fingers should be. They weren't sensor black, they were silvered and glassy, little mosaic patches that shimmied with their own minute logic. The two men stepped without looking at the camera. Their hands threw off neat squares like fish scales where light hits water. The one with the old ear scar took the latch on the gate, and the latch wobbled open under a megaphone of blur. Theo paused the frame and leaned closer. The boxes didn't just cover. They hovered, they snapped and loosened, they trembled a shade apart from the rest of the world. He had rubbed the camera lens clean with an old t-shirt when he'd set it up, had bent to check that he'd peeled the shipping plastic back like a sticker. He stood out there in a drizzle and cleared spider silk with a twig so thin it had hardly been a twig at all. He had never seen this. He had seen insects make comets and leaves throw veils, heard a mouse clack its teeth near enough to move the motion sensor. This was not rain or bug or breath. This was a thing that traveled with hands. He told himself the thought that came next was too neat, and that was how he knew it would not leave. The hands were the part of people that made contact. If something in the camera didn't like contact, or if the camera tried to keep contact private under some new default rule someone had slipped into a firmware update, that would be the part that would go to fog. He had done a lot of night shift rounds under bosses who changed the rules by email at dawn and said they had always been in effect. Theo worked his thumb over the buttons, walked back through the frames, scrubbing in small increments that felt respectful to the mechanism. Faces stayed faces. Jacket patches kept their stitches. The privacy blocks shivered over the place where skin met latch, where knuckles fell toward hinge, where a palm would soon know the grit on the metal, and the metal would remember the impression of that heat. It was not even that the blocks stuck to the hands. In some frames, the blocks hung over a latch before anyone touched it, a square, cupped like a palm that knew what was coming. He watched the approach as if the camera had a tide table for gestures and was reading it out before the tide rolled in. The kettle yowled, but he sat a minute longer with the tiny screen held in both hands, wanting the hiss to go away on its own. When he finally stood, he had to steady himself on the back of the chair. The chair was solid. The chair was wood he'd patched once with a splint cut from an apple crate. His hand ached in that way you get when your body anticipates being cold and curls itself around nothing. He poured water, put the mug into both palms, and took the first breath of steam and let the taste of bitter heat anchor him to the ordinary. He could leave it there, chalk it up to the camera's little brain misreading. But the men, who were not his, had been in his yard. That part wasn't an error. He drank half the mug standing at the sink, and then pulled on his coat again. He checked the shed lock and the gate's padlock, tasted rust just smelling at the chain. He ran his finger over the mud between the boards and found no new scuff. The frost still held its stippled pattern as if no one's weight had pressed it. The maple leaned the same way. The air held that chilly, sweet smell of old leaves going soft. He went back in and sat with the manual that had shipped with the camera. The manual's pages talked like a friend who didn't want to embarrass him. There were instructions for privacy zones, for masking, for how to tell the camera not to notice the road. He had never set masks. He had told it to do the simplest job: take a picture when something moved and keep taking pictures until nothing moved long enough. He drove into town and bought a better card and swapped it in and ran the camera through its paces with the logger that lived in its little menu. He set the shutter faster, as fast as the machine seemed to like, without scolding him. He tightened the strap against the tree until the bark gave a little. He liked a clean test. He liked saying he had done what he could, and then, if something still happened, it wasn't on him. Monday morning gave him the mail carrier cutting across the yard to shave time. Her large satchel kicked up on the hip like a sleeping dog. Hands blotted to tidy squares. A boy with a fishing rod, walking along the fence like he was following a thought. The neighbor with a bucket, moving toward the spigot. Every hand blurred to mosaic the instant skin approached metal or wood. In one frame, the little squares came ahead of any reach at all. A rectangle hung over the gate latch like a staged surprise. Another hovered over the shed lock like someone holding a warm washcloth to a fever. Timestamps lurched in the sequence in a way they did not normally do, like a dozy man telling a story out of order and then correcting himself with a cough. There was one image of his padlock with the shackle card back and no tracks in the mud, and then the next showed it set closed again, as if nothing had budged. He laid flour on the porch mat with the heel of his hand and a little flick of the wrist like he was smoothing grout. He angled the lens toward the door, which he'd hung himself with a sanded shim under the hinge. The flour lay smooth in the morning, combed by nothing but his sleeve where he'd leaned in too far. The footage showed a soft mosaic pressing the knob from outside, and then a matching block flickering inside, as if the house possessed its own hand to answer. The knob turned back against an invisible palm more politely than a person would. The door did not open. The door obeyed the agreement. He stared at the flower, at the camera, at the piece of bright tape he had used on the radius of the knob to see if it shifted. The tape sat in the same angle as before. There was nothing to say to any of it that made him feel bigger than the problem. In the last clip, the little screen showed a time that fell into morning's early wedges. There was Theo, his own careful stance that made him look like a man twice as cautious as he was. His hands appeared crowned with those neat squares of blur. He could see himself trying to hold fingers out to keep smudges off the lens, and the camera responding by blur shadowing each finger, each nail. Dropping the viewer, the blur dropped with him, faithful, as if already cataloguing what he would touch next. Behind him, the duct over the stove exhaled a scuffed metallic breath. The camera's light shifted from sky blue to a little steady red. A shift he'd seen before and never noticed as anything but a shift. The tiny display had a word for it he had never cared about. Now, over the recorded frame, the device in his hand chimed gentler than a bell, and a banner slid across that wasn't one he had seen before. New visitor added. It had always liked the word visitor, the way some technologies do to make surveillance friendlier. New visitor meant the camera thought someone had joined a registry. He moved through the day, cautiously after that, conscience like a new coin in his pocket. He kept his gloves on in the garage and used his shoulder to nudge doors. He found that hard to keep up, the little inconveniences adding up to a dull hurt between the eyes. He kept telling himself the same line, "It is nothing, it is a software thing. You are noticing only because once you notice, you see it everywhere." The mind has its trails the same way dogs leave paths in grass. He tried to set his mind to someone else's path for a while. He scrubbed the sink, the old white basin with hairline cracks like creek beds, taking satisfaction in the dark line disappearing as he worked the bristles in small circles. He emptied the trap, finding a wet hank of leaf-thin hair and the gritty sludge of soap and metal and whatever water acquires by living in old pipes. He paced slower in the hall to match the thermostat's mild size. He stopped by the library and returned a book on claw hammers and a jar of bolts he had checked out by mistake when he had been hard-headed about what belonged to which bin on the free table. In town, he kept his hands in his jacket until he had to pay. At the counter of the hardware store, the fluorescent lights buzzed in their old way, and the radio in the back room picked up static every time the compressor out by the cutting bench kicked on. He set a bundle of rags and a box of screws on the scarred laminate. The scanner beeped and then beeped again, and then the clerk pulled the package back and shook it, like that could make the code more legible. They traded an apologetic look. The clerk made a face like someone who has long ago used up their allocation of patience in a day and now only performs approximation. "Things been touchy," the clerk said. "Sometimes it says it read when it did not." Theo nodded. He paid in cash because he felt like a card would be trickier than the sound of bills counting. The clerk's own hands showed no blur here in life, but when Theo raised his eyes toward the little convex mirror that showed the aisle, the mirror's curve caught the register top in a tiny crescent. For a blink of reflection, the clerk's fingers wore the same sober squares. Theo looked away and told himself that curved glass makes its own rules. He took the paper bag. The paper was thin enough to burn through with a thumb. At home, he set one rag aside for the camera lens and gave the lens a careful wipe in circles. He took out the card and ran the menu through every item. The long press of a button gave him a screen nobody would read who did not have to. It showed firmware numbers and version strings, and a date he wasn't too certain the camera knew truly. He toggled privacy settings off, and then back on, and then off again, like flicking a light to see if a bulb has life. He put the card back. He cut into half a bread loaf and buttered it and ate it standing up. The knife handle felt slick and then dry, as if the palm had changed its mind halfway through being a palm. He set the knife down and braced both hands on the counter, and under each heel of his hand, the formica felt warm the way formica gets warm only when heat has had time to go into it. Theo had not warmed it. The house had warmed it for him. Sleep started to take on a tatty feel. He woke at hours he would not have named out loud and lay with his eyes open until the room suggested it might be later than that. In dreams, he was forever halfway to touching a thing and then catching himself, hearing a sound like the hush that rises in a gym when the lights go dark after a game. The dog track in the yard looked from the bedroom window too clean, like it had been ironed by weather. He found himself eating less and then eating suddenly, like someone had told him the pantry would lock in a minute. He misplaced the little viewer twice and then found it in predictable places, and this irritated him more than the misplacing had, because it suggested he was not special, not unraveling in any glamorous way, just distracted the way tired people are. He started keeping notes because he could say notes are not obsession. Notes are adult method. He had a pen that wrote smooth enough to pass for clever. The first page read the way a person speaks when they suspect someone is grading them. Monday. Mail carrier hands blurred, boy hands blurred, neighbor hands blurred. Monday night. Squares hovered before contact at latch and lock. Tuesday morning. Flower smooth, footage shows knob turned from both sides by blocks, door does not open, tape angle unchanged. The next line landed harder. Camera labeled me as visitor. He put the cap on the pen and set the notebook inside the drawer that held rubber bands, screws of the wrong size, 2 dried-out markers, a postcard from a fair, reminding itself to be cheerful. He thought of telling his neighbor across the street, the one who built decks for a living and who could be counted on to laugh without mean edges. He pictured himself describing a box that stands for a hand, a blur that knows a touch before it happens. The scene kept turning toward a joke you tell yourself to prove you are still fit for company, and that meant he never did it. He did stand with his arms crossed and watch the neighbor carry lengths of treated pine to the backyard and set them across 2 sawhorses and clamp them like calm animals. He watched the man's hands reach and slide, and he heard the small song of metal meeting teeth and the softer thud of wood on wood. He told himself the world was the world, and the camera had decided to be a fussy translation. Midweek came with a public notice posted on the fence near the footpath by the creek. Yellow paper under cloudy tape. The county seal printed in faint ink. An advisory about contact with surfaces down near the old pump station where a pipe had ruptured last season. Words about residues that may persist, about hand washing and the wisdom of gloves. The notice did not match his problem exactly, which made it feel related in the way a distant cousin can still share your jawline. He looked at the map in his head of how water ran under the town and thought about how the pump station breathed out sometimes, that odd breath that made rust smell like something with pollen in it. He imagined the vent over his stove speaking to the vent at the pump station, the way windows sometimes seem to glare at each other when you walk a block after dark. The library closed for a day for a staff meeting and then opened late because the heater had chosen mischief. The clerk at the post office wore fingerless gloves, joked that she was making a statement with fashion and heat bills. The news from the radio on his shelf stuttered between songs and the weather. The man on the weather laughed about a cold front finding its boots. The music that followed had a little hiss between notes, like the tape had gone thin. His hands cracked where the lines go if you work, and then wash and then work again. He kept a jar of petroleum jelly by the sink and remembered to use it less than he said he would. He noticed that when he approached a handle now, the body was halfway to a flinch. A shoulder came up a degree. The skin on his palm recognized the small air signature of metal cooling air around it. He told himself he was developing a little caution, the same way you learn not to reach into drawer corners where blades roll. He told himself it was only the camera that recorded squares. But then, when he stood by the fridge and the compressor clicked on and the door seal pulled itself sugar tight, he felt an anticipation in the room, like a body preparing for a hand, and he had yet to move. He reached slowly, not wanting to surprise an appliance. The magnet strip on the calendar fluttered. He opened the door and stood in the light a moment longer than needed. The cold had a smell like faint fruit, wrapped in something that wasn't fruit. He set another card in the camera to keep the footage of his own actions separate, like lanes in a pool. The footage stayed true to its new habit. Smoothing flour meant corresponding squares eased along, one inside, one out. Water from the hose moved a little slower when he reached for the spigot, like water played along for theater. The gate latch made a shape of blur around itself, the way fog sometimes makes a halo around lamps. He started to test without knowing he was testing, letting his hand hover above the countertop, moving it left and then right to see if the room would place a blur where he was likely to be. He found that he was right more often than he liked. He reminded himself his own body told on him, Habits, arcs, reach distance. A man is a set of likely movements. He slowed everything to see it in slices. He felt older or wiser or only tired. If he forced himself to leave the house more, he could break the spell in the open air. He walked to the laundromat with a bag of towels and stood watching a washer buck a little and settle. The windows fogged at the same height along the row, making a band like a stripe around the building. He loaded quarters and stood back, though he didn't think the camera cared what the laundromat did. The attendant swabbed a folding table with a rag that had been damp too long. When the wash ended, Theo stepped forward and bumped the lid to break the seal and felt the small pressure release against his fingers. He froze with the lid lifted and realized he had been braced for a counterhand, something in the air pushing back. Nothing did. He told himself he had enough quiet in him to make up such sensations. On the slow walk back, he took the footpath by the creek. The ground held a lace of thin ice where puddles formed. The air filled, as it always did near the pump station, with that breath of salt that wasn't TC, but had learned C as a story from the mouths of pipes. He kept his hands in his pockets and then, without planning to, pulled one out and laid it on the rail of the footbridge to feel the old splinters. He closed his eyes for a count that had no numbers. He pictured a neat square of blur hovering where his palm met wood. He pictured a second square, visible only to some registrant of contacts, hovering under the rail as if the bridge itself had a hand to welcome him. He told himself that picturing is not knowing, but he did not lift his hand right away. A truck rattled over the road above and blew a horn at a friend whose car held a bumper with no rivals for ripest rust. The world made normal noises in normal order. Theo went home and fed himself on soup from a can he had doctored with a handful of quick noodles because, in him, salt wanted a friend. He sat in the chair with the apple crate splint and listened to the ductwork talk, little pings like acorns dropping in a forest he had never visited. When he finally slid into bed, he lay on his side and stared at the pale rectangle of the window and kept his hands under the covers like a child who had been told a story that wasn't quite meant for children. Days took on a rhythm, like a man tapping a pencil on a counter without knowing he is tapping. Work at the warehouse, where his job was less a job than a series of patient motions. Match the box to the slip. Make sure the items counted match the totals the scanner sings. Set it along the line. Start again. He had always found a quiet there. Now the scanner occasionally stuttered when he reached to aim its red line, as if the red light disliked the skin more than the carton labels. The unit would buzz, and then buzz again, and he would have to move his wrist just so, and then it would give up and beep a cheerful beep. He noticed that the bad read happened most reliably when he reached ahead of himself, when he anticipated too well where the carton's code would be, the way a person anticipates the end of a song. The lead hand at the line was a quiet woman who wore her hair pulled through the back of a cap and said as few words as a person can and still be kind. She watched him one afternoon frown at the scanner and shake it, and she said, not unkindly, "They read what they read." He nodded. The words settled like dust. He went home and lifted the trash can lid with one knuckle and lowered it again with the same knuckle just to see if the room arranged its invisible answer differently for each. The kitchen did not share its rules. He washed his hands until the skin felt like paper you can almost see through. He slept a little because a person must. By the week's turn, there was a note on the community board by the grocer. The pump station would be closed to non-essential maintenance until further notice. The small print said the word non-essential twice, which meant something argued with itself in the office that wrote it. Someone had added with a pen a cartoon glove giving a thumbs up. It made Theo briefly comforted in the way jokes do when they are not funny, but declare allegiance. He collected small hurts, a cut from a can, a bruise from the truck door, a catch in his back that asked him to sleep on the other side. He read a new chapter in a paperback about a boat, losing his place because boats and their ropes ran together after the second page. He scrubbed the tub and felt like he was scouring at luck. He watched the footage each evening, a ritual he would not have called a ritual unless asked, and said to himself each time that he was watching only so he could later say he had seen everything there was. The camera kept its opinion. New visitor had been added to the registry of the machine's notice. He imagined a table in its small brain with columns for who and when and what, a list that did not need names as long as it had patterns. He imagined that his hands had been given a number the way parcels are given numbers, but the machine had been polite enough not to show him. He tried to find that courtesy comforting. In the night, a sound woke him, not loud, more persistent than loud. He lay with his eyes open, throat tight, because he had been asleep, and the body doesn't like to wake with someone shouting the room without using lungs. The sound was a little tremor in the vent above the stove, a small tittering like someone tongued the grill. He waited for it to end, so that it could be only a single event. The sound stopped and then came back 10 breaths later, and then stopped. And when it returned again, it had moved from the kitchen to the hallway, and from the hallway back to the kitchen, the way a person might move when they try not to step on creaky places. He climbed up, pulled on pants, walked past the tiny square of a nightlight he kept in the bathroom because a person has to accept his eyes are not as keen. Moon or street or someone else's porch cast a thin blade onto the living room carpet. In the kitchen, the vent exhaled and then held its breath and then exhaled again. He laid his palm on the stovetop without thinking and jerked it back, because his brain had trained his hand away from surfaces, whether they were hot or not. He forced the palm back down and felt the cool enamel and told himself aloud in the smallest voice, "Stop it." He was not speaking to the vent, only to himself. He turned the light on and then off and watched the room reassemble itself twice. He stayed long enough to turn it into memory and then returned to bed, because morning would come, however he spent the hours until it did. He dreamed of shelves, from the warehouse and not from the warehouse, shelves with boxes that all knew their own places, shelves with spaces shaped like dumb hands. In the dream, he had to touch each underside of a shelf before he could move to the next aisle. And the act grew so slow, he woke up with his arm half lifted from the mattress. The trail camera waited where he had strapped it. He found himself talking to it in his head, as if it were a dog he'd left outdoors and felt guilty about when it rained. He worked gently at the strap to give the bark a rest from pressure. He found a cobweb like spun milk in one corner and eased it away with a small stick. He told the maple that it was doing good work holding up whatever this was. On a morning when fog sat low like a thought you can't shake, he had the oddest urge to go to the pump station and stand by its chain-link fence and look at the boxy building and the pipe ends like the mouth of some measureless horn. He did not go, because the sign had said closed, and he had never been a man who liked to climb a fence just because a fence existed. He walked instead to the footbridge, put both hands down on the same rail, and held steady until a train passed an enormous stretch away and sent a shiver traveling through the ground and up into the wood, as if the earth had a cough. He counted steps home without using numbers and lost his place twice. The day warmed enough that melted frost gave the road its dark splotches that promised nothing except that water has pulses. A dog barked 3 doors down, with that low bored bark that says, "Nothing is wrong, nothing is especially right." He reached his porch and saw the mat askew, and saw the dusting of flour he hadn't bothered to sweep because it felt like evidence in a moodier court. He knelt. The flour was scuffed now in a crescent that matched exactly the angle of his own foot when he left in the morning. He told himself to stop being the kind of man who lets flour tell him stories. He ate an apple. The smell of the core for a moment made him think of the pump station again, which was not right, but maybe the house carried a thread of damp from somewhere hidden. He lifted the trash bag from the can and tied its red band and carried it out, trying not to see the moment that his hand would meet the lid as a scene the world was pre-writing for him. It felt like a contract he was always signing and never reading. He let out a laugh with no humor in it, then noticed that no laugh ever comes with humor. The humor arrives later, if at all. At work, the lead hand set a sheet on the corkboard above the time clock. There was an advisory from the company's safety office about contact dermatitis and certain cleaners used on shared surfaces. Wash your hands, it said, and limit contact with unknown residues. The posted page was all the proof anyone would have needed that the world made its own rules without his permission. He read the sheet twice. He thought about that word, residues, and how ugly and perfect it was. It was honest about everything left behind by touch, all the marks a person didn't see but honored or regretted. By the time the week turned, he found he had changed his way of walking through doors. He no longer reached naturally. He paused near a knob to allow an invisible protocol to complete itself. He would even lean the shoulder and bump the door back against the frame with his arm, smiling at himself as if this trick were clever and not a capitulation. He bought a pair of cheap cotton gloves and told himself they were for yard work. He wore them to sweep and then realized sweeping with cotton gloves is like trying to fold paper with mittens. He washed the gloves and they dried stiff and kept, afterward, a faint whiff of machine oil no matter what soap he used. He placed them on the counter and sat with them like you would with boots warming near a vent. He reached to put them away and paused to see if now the room would answer with its own arranged blur. Something like a tickle rose in his wrists. He stopped by the bar on the corner of the road leading out of town and ordered a sandwich he did not finish. A game played silent on a screen over the bar, men running and stopping and running again, their hands spearing and cupping, ball invisible at the beats the station chose to replay. He watched other patrons lay their hands flat on wood or clench them into fists or pin them under thighs when the conversation went a way they didn't like. He thought about how much of a person's life lives in the theater of hands. He stood and left a tip that felt too light and walked past the mirror behind the bar in which the backs of heads and hands nested forever inside themselves. That night the vent gave a breath, and then another breath, and then stopped. The camera took its quiet interval shots of a yard that ducked under fog and then rose out again like a swimmer. There were no men he did not know in the frames. There were two cats that did not know each other and performed the precise dance of beings who would rather not figure out what happens if contact lasts. The neighbor's bucket sat on the upside-down milk crate in the usual place. Theo sat in the chair with the splint and kept the viewer resting in his palm, but did not scroll. He watched the way the light from the street dragged along the wall like slow water. He found himself humming one of the half songs from the radio, the one with a whistle and too many O's. He wondered if he would wake late or early. The body felt like it would do one and call it the other. In the morning, he replaced the card and, without meaning to, kept glancing at the camera, the way you glance at a person who has just told you they remember every time you've touched them. He felt a shiver of embarrassment deep as bone, as if he'd been caught picking up a penny from under a chair when no one else was looking. He busied his hands. He sanded a notch in the back gate so it would close without catching. He boiled water for tea because coffee had started to taste like pennies. He wiped the line of condensation from the window over the sink with the side of his thumb and watched how quickly it returned. He avoided touching his face because it seemed indecent now, a kind of interference. After lunch, he took the truck out and drove a loop road that curved past the fields where the old mill used to store what's no longer stored. Flat grass hung under a high sky like drapes someone forgot to pull shut. On a little rise, he parked and sat long enough that the engine's warmth seeped into the cab seat and then into him. Through the windshield, the world was mild. He lifted his hand to the dash and held it an inch from touching, and for a silly second he thought he saw the plastic ripple toward his palm, as if a ripple had any cause other than light. He let the hand drop to his leg and felt foolish and did not mind that feeling. Back home, he found a note stuck under the camera strap, limp as a wet snake. The ink had bled almost to nothing, the way cheap pens give up under the least wash. He had to take a photo with his phone and then increase the contrast in the gallery until the letters thickened like old lines in a map. The message was nothing but a little square hastily drawn and the words, "Sorry, practice, wrong." The handwriting was tense and small. Under it, pressed deep through the paper and into the plastic of the strap, was an impression of a grid that might have been the back of a cheap legal pad or the pattern of a palm, pressed hard and long. He held the note and felt a sensation that was not anger and not fear, but the thin slice between the two. Someone had been in his yard and had stood where he always stood and had left a confession that explained nothing. He turned the paper over as if the other side might hold the part that mattered. It held nothing but a faint print of his own fingerprints, caught in grease from breakfast, that he knew the camera could now call by a name in its registry. He thought then of driving to the pump station. He didn't. He thought of calling a number that would send a car with words on its side, and two people with comfortable belts and eyes that had seen far weirder than a note and a camera with a bad habit. He did not. He put the note into the binder he kept in a drawer for papers that might someday matter. He set the binder on the table and placed the jar of jelly on top as a weight, and then laughed at himself for granting the paper the possibility of escape. Evening slid in and made a clean seam along the counter where sun had landed an hour before. The vent breathed twice in a way that had become almost friendly. Theo fed himself plainly and stood in the doorway to the yard, listening to a bird he could not name make that short call like a misfired idea. In the frame of the porch, he felt once again the body's expectation that the knob would meet a counterhand, something that acknowledged his contact the way machines had been made to do. The hair along his arms rose, but he was chilly, and there was no poetry in hair and weather. He reached for the knob, felt the faint tacky pull of old paint under his fingers, turned, and the door closed. He knew then that there was a count being kept. He did not know the shape of the ledger. He could feel the edges of an agreement he had signed without reading. He set the camera S viewer down on the table and watched the red light on the charging block pulse. In, out, in. He breathed to match it and then purposely broke the rhythm. He sat with all of that for longer than any person would sit with a machine on a normal night. He would have said, if asked, that he was only giving himself a chance to feel foolish and then move on. The world could always be a camera with a bad new rule. A man could always be someone who overfits patterns to noise and then slinks from the mirror. He turned from the table. The vent whispered like old newspapers stacked in a corner dough. The camera's light settled to steady. The little screen went to black. The house, in its old way, pressed its weight around him. He lay down across the bed with his clothes still on and put the back of his hand under his cheek and thought of a square hovering where his hand met his own face, and below that another square answering from the pillow, and felt a quiet he did not trust wash over him, as if he had finally understood that not touching is a kind of touch too in a world that has decided to count. The next morning began with fog thick enough to scrape with a fingernail. It smothered the maple and pressed against the windows like something wanting to be let in. Theo woke early without the alarm. He sat on the edge of the bed and waited for his eyes to agree with him that it was morning. The vent muttered once, then stopped. In the quiet, the house made small noises, the tick of the baseboard heating, the wet sigh of air moving through pipes, a groan from somewhere deep in the frame. He held his breath, thinking he heard someone outside, but it was only the sound of fog against the siding, that soft hiss like a cloth drawn over skin. He brewed coffee because he didn't know what else to do. The first swallow burned his tongue. He stood at the window and watched his own reflection tremble in the glass as the light behind him shifted. It looked like he was breathing on both sides of the pane. The maple's outline swam in and out of the fog, a slow exhalation of branches. He thought of the note under the strap. Sorry, practice, wrong. And imagined the hand that had written it. Small, careful, maybe young. A hand that didn't expect to be seen. He told himself he'd take the camera down today. Enough was enough. He'd mail it back to the company, let their technicians find the glitch. He'd say the firmware bugged out, some AI mask gone haywire. They'd send a replacement. He'd hang the new one under the eave, somewhere civilized where no fog or frost could mess with it. He'd be normal again, a man who left his front door without studying the knob. He carried his mug outside and walked across the yard. The air tasted like pennies again. He felt the faint grit of flour under his boots where he'd never swept it. The camera sat where it always had, calm as a birdhouse. Its lens faced the yard, the porch, the stretch of fence where the two men had passed. The red LED blinked once when it recognized him, the way it always did. For a second he thought of the word visitor, that ridiculous politeness the software used, and almost laughed. The strap was slick with dew. He tugged it loose, but the buckle resisted. It had fused a little to the bark, the way things do when they've settled into place too long. He worked at it gently, muttering. His fingers slipped and the camera tilted, its lens pointing upward. The light from the fog caught the glass and threw back a small flare that made him flinch. The device chirped once, like a tiny bird. Then the screen lit up on its own. He hadn't pressed anything. It came alive with that pale grey boot sequence he'd seen 100 times, except now the words were slower. The date flickered, then changed twice. The status line scrolled through unreadable text, a crawl of symbols that weren't numbers or letters. The word reviewing blinked at the bottom, then the camera settled on a still frame, the porch, the mat, the closed door. The timestamp, sometime before dawn, though the digits meant nothing now. The footage began to play without his asking. Something stood in the yard. A tall shape, but not a man. The fog made it half-transparent. Where arms should have been were those same restless squares, shivering blocks of blur, hundreds now, maybe thousands, flitting in and out of each other like minnows. They reached toward the door, and at the same time the door on screen trembled. Then, impossibly, a second field of squares bloomed inside the house, reaching back, mirroring the gesture. Two swarms meeting through the wood. For a moment the knob glowed red-hot white. The sound was soft, like breath on glass. He stepped back before realizing he was doing it. The camera's microphone must have caught his own retreat because the screen wobbled, and he saw himself, a ghostly figure through fog, standing exactly where he stood now, holding the camera, watching himself. The loop folded on itself like a throat clearing. He shut it off with a jab that hurt his thumb. When he lifted his eyes, the fog had come closer. It pressed right up to his boots, lapping the toes. It wasn't drifting anymore. It was listening. He swallowed and tried to say something. Enough, maybe, or I'm done. His voice didn't carry. The fog ate it whole. He finished freeing the strap, tucked the camera under his arm, and walked toward the porch. The air thickened with every step, each breath damp and metallic. He could barely see the door now, just the faint line of light where the frame met the jamb. His own outline moved in the reflection, just shadow and dim motion. The knob glimmered wetly, haloed by a faint tremor, a shimmer that matched what he'd seen on the screen. He stopped a foot away. The house looked wrong in the fog, like it had shifted forward an inch while he was gone. He raised his hand to the knob. The glove lay forgotten on the counter inside. His palm hovered an inch away, just at the point where warmth from his skin should meet the cool of the brass. He waited for that little chill that meant contact was real. Instead, he saw it. A square of blur forming in the air between his hand and the metal. Then another, smaller, on the other side of the door, rising to meet it. They jittered and fused, a handshake of static. Theo jerked back, heart hammering. The squares dissolved, but the air didn't clear. It seemed denser now, heavier with invisible pattern. He backed down the steps, the wood slick beneath his boots. The camera in his arm clicked. Its LED turned red again. He didn't have to look to know the message. New visitor added. He walked fast toward the shed, meaning to shut the camera inside, to smother its view. The fog moved with him, slower but deliberate. At the shed, he fumbled for the padlock. His fingers felt thick, clumsy. The padlock turned before he touched it. It swung open with a soft creak as if it had been waiting. The door eased inward a few inches, then stopped. Inside, darkness smelled of oil and sawdust and something faintly sweet, like overripe fruit. He set the camera on the workbench and stepped back. The red light blinked, then steadied. A tiny speaker inside let out a whispering click, like film running out. The screen flicked on again, another clip, time-stamped minutes ahead of now. That couldn't be right. The frame showed the same shed from the same angle, but he wasn't in it. The bench was empty. The padlock hung loose, the door ajar, fog creeping along the floorboards. Then a shape moved in from the right, him, but the hands, he saw it clearly, were not hands anymore. They were arrays of flickering squares, bright and busy, like the pixels in the camera itself had climbed up into him. He reached instinctively to turn the camera off, but his own hands, real, flesh-colored, were trembling. He stared at them. They looked normal, but as he turned them in the light, tiny flickers followed his fingertips, faint at first, like after-images. When he wiggled his fingers, the air quivered around them, mirroring the motion a split second late. Each motion came with a faint electronic tick, as though reality were buffering him. He grabbed a rag, wrapped it tight around one hand, then the other. It didn't help. The shimmer bled right through the fabric. He could feel a buzzing, too, a current under the skin. Not painful, but deep, intimate, like being watched from the inside. He backed out of the shed. The fog clung to his shoulders, pressing close, as though it wanted to feel what he was feeling. He tried to steady his breath, but each exhale came back to him with a lag, like the world needed a second to process it. At the fence, he paused. The gap where the two men had crossed yawned wider than he remembered. Boards leaned inward, as though something had brushed them. He could see the faint trail of footprints beyond, half swallowed by frost. He thought about the note, the word practice. Maybe those men weren't thieves. Maybe they were testing something. Maybe they'd brought it here. A noise behind him, a short mechanical chirp. The camera had turned itself off, or on, hard to tell anymore. Then, faintly, from the vent above the kitchen, another answering chirp. The same tone, same rhythm, as though the house had learned the sound. He stepped backward toward the porch. The boards creaked once, twice, then held. The fog eddied around his knees. He could see movement in it now, little squares darting like fish under milk. His own reflection in the window was almost gone, eaten away by flicker. For a second, he thought he saw another shape beside him. Same height, same stance, its hands lifted toward the knob. When he looked directly, there was only the fog. He made it inside somehow. He wasn't sure if he turned the knob or if the door opened for him. The air indoors was still, warm in the way that made you sweat behind the ears. The vent hummed a low, even tone. It sounded close to a heartbeat. He went to the counter and placed the camera there. The LED blinked once, then stayed dark. He turned the faucet on, ran cold water, washed his hands until they hurt. The skin went red, then pale, then something in between. When he looked down, his reflection in the steel of the sink wavered. The blur was there, each hand capped by a halo of jittering pixels. He shut the faucet, watched the ripples settle. The blur didn't fade. He picked up the camera again. out of some stupid need to confirm it to see what it saw. The screen came alive before he pressed a button. A new video waited. The thumbnail showed his own kitchen. The timestamp was 10 minutes in the future. He hit play. He watched himself standing at the counter, exactly as he was now. The hands glimmered brighter, almost transparent. The walls pulsed faintly, like lungs. Behind him, the vent grill flexed, a shallow inhale. The clip ended abruptly with the same message, "New visitor added." The kitchen lights flickered, the hum from the vent deepened. He felt something shift inside the walls, slow, deliberate, a current traveling through metal. He stepped back, bumping into the table. The table rattled like a living thing. A fork slid across the surface on its own, leaving a faint trail of static where the tines had been. He turned toward the door. The knob twitched. The faint square shimmer appeared again, one outside, one inside. They touched, fused, and disappeared. The door eased open an inch, just enough to let fog curl in. Theo didn't move. He watched the fog slide over the threshold and spread across the floor in small, breathing waves. It wasn't cold. It felt neutral, like air stripped of temperature. It reached the table leg, the chair, his boots. Everywhere it touched, the faint blur bloomed and vanished, as though the house were recording everything for later review. He thought of the word cataloging, the way he'd said it to himself that first night. The blur lowered with him, faithful, cataloging what he would touch next. Maybe that was its purpose, to know, to map, to gather. The camera on the counter clicked. The LED turned blue again. The screen displayed a new prompt he hadn't seen before. Sync complete. He picked it up. The screen showed his yard, the fence, the fog thinning as dawn pushed through. In the bottom corner, a small window displayed his own face, captured live. He watched his expression tighten, the mouth pulling small. The feed froze. His own face stayed fixed there, eyes wide, staring back at him. Then slowly, the eyes on the screen blinked. Not his blink, a beat late, independent. A second blink, slower. The reflection smiled. It was a polite, patient smile. Theo set the camera down carefully, like a cup too full. He backed away until the counter pressed into his spine. The vent sighed, a long release of air, as though the house had been holding its breath all night. The lights dimmed to a soft orange. Somewhere outside, a bird started to call, then fell silent mid-note. He went to the window. The fog was pulling back now, revealing the yard, the maple, the empty fence line. Everything looked ordinary again. Even the air seemed to forget its shimmer. He exhaled and laid a hand against the glass. For a moment, his reflection followed. Then a faint square bloomed between palm and pane. Another formed on the outside, matching it perfectly, aligning finger for finger. The surface pulsed once, twice. The glass didn't feel cold anymore. It felt alive, pulsing gently beneath his skin. He didn't pull away. Behind him, the vent whispered the same 3 words the camera had used. New visitor added. Outside, the maple creaked softly, as if acknowledging him. Inside, the light steadied. The camera sat on the counter, recording nothing and everything, its little LED pulsing in rhythm with his breath. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more content. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Feel free to leave a comment below with your thoughts or questions. I love hearing from you. Until next time, take care and stay awesome.